Hello again everybody, and today I'm going to talk about Roman villas and villa life in particular. One of the most characteristic features of Roman life is the institution of the villa, and the villas are found right throughout the whole empire, from the southern edges of the Sahara Desert right to the north of Germany and up into Britain. Not all throughout Britain, as I'll explain in a few minutes. So, villas were crucial to how the Roman Empire worked, and they were an important part of the economy, particularly the rural economy, the agricultural economy. We know a fair bit about how villas were organised because a guidance manual, a didactic work by a writer called Columella survives. So he tells us where to put the rooms to greatest advantage, what sort of living facilities there should be for the farm workers, slaves, how you should go about choosing the best person to be in charge of the workers, how to choose a wheelicus, a bailiff, how you should choose a partner for him. So he didn't get any great choice in the matter of who his life partner was going to be. It's interesting in Britain that most of the villas, almost all of the villas, are in the south and east part of the country. If you were to draw a line of the initial frontier, from Lincoln down to Exeter, perhaps advanced a little in the northwest as far as Chester, pretty much all the villas are to the south and east of that line. But that's also a function of that being where the low-lying land was. So the north and the west, that's much more likely to be upland, and you can't grow so much on that. Much harder to farm, and the Romans were as interested in that. So that in itself is an interesting thing to say about villas. There are several large villas along the south coast. I've talked about one of those, perhaps the biggest one of all, at Fishbourne, which may even be have a palace status if that's where Cogidubnus lived. But there are others at places like Angmering and Bignor. And there are also quite a lot in the Cotswolds, and one of those, one of the most famous villas in Britain, is at a place called Chedworth. And there's some similarities between Chedworth and Bignor. Both of them started to be built in the late 1st century, and they were both altered and developed significantly later. Both of them have major displays of mosaics, and so that indicates something about the wealth of the people who lived there. But who worked there? What work did they do, and how did that fit into the local economy? Well, there have been some suggestions in recent years from classical scholars and from ancient historians that some of the villas in Britain, at least in the south and east, were more or less state-run grain farms. Wherever the Romans went, they wanted to make their occupation pay. One of the things they were always short of was grain, as the Roman Empire expanded, first in Italy and then taking on Sicily and then incorporating Egypt. Wherever they went, they wanted grain. So one of the things they did at an early stage in Britain was develop grain estates, and that is part of the reason why they are where they are in the south and the east. One of the signs that this would be a key part of the economy would be finding granaries. Now, there are granaries and associated buildings, corn drying, grain drying facilities and so on, found at Bignor, but they've not yet been found at Chedworth. Now, that doesn't mean to say they're not there or they were never there. It just means they haven't been found yet, and most people agree that sooner or later they will be found when all the area around the villa is eventually excavated, well, if it is eventually excavated. So as well as growing grain, what else happened on a villa? Well, there was animal husbandry as well. We know that there were animals such as sheep and rabbits and deer and pigs, some of which were cultivated, some of which were hunted, but they all form part of a villa economy. Not so many cattle. Cattle, or oxen perhaps we should say, were largely used for pulling a plough, but they didn't form a major part of the economy in the same way, say, that sheep did. Who did all the work? Well, Columella says it's going to be slaves, and it's exactly the sort of thing that slaves exist for. There's very little evidence of what the lives of slaves were like from Chedworth, or indeed from anywhere else. That's partly because slaves didn't have possessions, they were themselves possessions. One Roman writer regards them as farming equipment with voices. But also, if they didn't have anything that they might have been associated with them tends to be made out of organic materials. So that's not going to survive too well, and archaeologists aren't going to find very much evidence of that. There must, however, have been slaves, because otherwise the villa economy wouldn't work, and Columella tells us of the critical importance of this. And there are a number of things, like in Spartacus' slave revolt, there were a lot of the slaves who first went over to him were runaways from villas in Italy. At Chedworth, we know there was a certain amount of metalworking, because some archaeology of things like metal crucibles involved in metal smelting have been found. There are a number of iron tools there, and some bronze also, including some quite nice bronze decorative work. So some sort of industrial, small-scale industrial activity like that must have been there, and making farming tools and so on would have been pretty important. Where did people trade? Well, in the case of the Cotswolds, it's almost certainly at Corinium, which at one stage was the second biggest place in Roman Britain, behind only London. And so things would have been traded with Corinium and then much further afield. So what can we say to sum all this up? Who were the owners? Well, we don't actually know who owned Chedworth, but they must have been very rich. They must have wanted to impress, because quite a lot of the stuff that's at Chedworth, things like bathhouses, quite opulent, quite sizable, especially the mosaics, they were there to impress people who visited. Maybe there was a certain amount of competition between the owners or the landlords of different villas in that area. Maybe some of the decorations were there just to say to people, even though we're in Britain, we can still live a civilized life. And maybe that's what our modern message is for today.